And this entire media campaign just fizzled out, but I'd like to admit that no one canceled denazification completely, and it's still one of the formal Russian war aims, and it's still mentioned in the media. And here is my question to you and maybe Yulia, because I don't really know the answer. I don't really know the answer to these questions. Why did this happen? So I saw some reports of Russian journalists who work abroad, and they claim that there are some that they've seen some propagandists like instructions, and where Kremlin told top Russian propaganda officials to just to kind of lessen the usage of this word in the media, because allegedly ordinary Russians don't understand that. It's like it's the inside information. I cannot verify that. I can trust it or distrust it. But just from the philosophical point of view, I guess maybe I could agree with that, but I would be it's really interesting for me to hear other people's thoughts of that, and also maybe why do you think that Russians decide to invoke this old Ukrainian Nazi narrative in the first place? I don't really, I have some thoughts on that, but I would like to hear your thoughts. And also, so yeah, here are the points for the discussion. And if someone wants to say something, I would be really happy to hear that.
Come on, please, don't turn it into the monologue. Oh, Tommaso, afraid to...
Hi everyone. Tommaso Canetta from Italy. Nice to meet you. I don't have an answer, but maybe it could be, at least in my experience, in something we are witnessing, that this kind of narrative is most effective in Western Europe, in some sector of the public opinions that looked in the past with favor to USSR, and it's still sensitive to the denazification narrative, also considering some controversial episodes like the one in Odessa in 2014, and those kind of activities of the far right that exist in Ukraine, like it exists in many other countries, of course. So I think maybe is more aimed to those targets, this kind of disinformation narrative. It's a possibility.
I agree with you, because, well, how I see Russian propaganda working, it has three principal audiences, right? It's the West. Putin talks to the West and refers to the West a lot, and it's before 2022 it was us Ukrainians, because he or they believed that, as I said, that our society is normal. We just have some neo-Nazi politicians, and we just there should, like, normal guys will come and change everything. So they talk to us, but still, there is still a domestic audience there, and so on this chart we monitored Russian language, and it's Russian language media. So it's still, they believed that Russian people maybe this reference to Nazism, it will invoke maybe some very powerful feelings in Russian people because of the World War II memories, and the cult. Basically, they developed a cult. It's the state ideology, around World War II celebration, the Victory Day, and so on. But for some reason, it didn't work. My explanation is that maybe, I don't know, Putin is from an older generation. For him, it's significant, right? But the generations are changing, and World War II events were quite long time ago. So maybe it doesn't invoke that powerful of a feeling in Russian people that they were expected to. I don't know. That's just my thoughts, maybe. I don't know. Anyone else?
So if someone want to add something, some ideas, because I think there is no one right answer on this question. It's quite it's systematic thing. So I just wanted to add my thoughts on it. I think that denazification narrative is have too many conflicts inside it. Oh, I see Sandro. Yes. Sandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I'm Sandra. I'm representing the Media Development Foundation from Georgia and its fact-checking platform Myth Detector. We have also been very actively involved in combating mis and disinformation around the war. So there are also quite a few trends that we have observed. And this particular one, I think, is very interesting. And obviously, I agree with the ideas that have been voiced already. To my understanding, is that denazification was like the first primary justification for the intervention, which started like from the very, very beginning. And I think not that it wasn't successful, but I think it was somehow mixed with alternative narratives. For example, because what disinformation does in this particular context is that it adapts to local context and it adapts to some new trends that are emerging in the political context. So we started with denazification, which was like a very big umbrella term. And then it got somehow dissected into smaller narratives, which were like more adapted to like specific events. For example, we saw the increase in disinformation that revolved around migrants or Ukrainian refugees. We saw an increase in disinformation that targeted Ukrainian biolaboratories, now sanctions, and etc. So I think what happened here is that there was a need for something grand, some kind of an umbrella term, which would unite the disinformation as a whole. But then it would also be useful to somehow direct those narratives and then to somehow pinpoint them into specific directions, which then were like classified into the themes that I've just mentioned. So I think this could also be an explanation that as time goes by, new topics, new narratives emerge, new things happen, for example. So we obviously need to expect these bigger umbrella terms to like somehow dissolve into smaller, more precise narratives.
Could be an interesting thought. And Yulia, you were saying that you think that denazification it's a conflicting topic. Yulia? Oui.
I think that I just want to add that Yura also already mentioned that they first of all they tried to denazificate the Ukrainian government, but then when the war became longer and longer and they couldn't take Kiev in 3 days, that's why they started to write about the denazification of universities, of schools, of Ukrainian population. And there is, we see the conflict between different narratives of Ukrainian Russian brothers. Yes, but it's about the brotherhood, about the Ruski Mir and Russian world concept, about the willingness to cooperate with Ukrainians, with normal Ukrainians, yes, and willingness to denazificate these normal Ukrainians. I think that there is a big problem inside this category of denazification of Ukrainians. How many Nazis here in Ukraine, actually? There is, we still couldn't find any criteria of Nazis. Who is Nazi? If I'm Nazi for Russian propaganda. propaganda, of course. It's really difficult to merge these two concepts of brotherhood and normal Ukrainians who wait for Russia and the whole Ukraine denazification. I think it's a big problem, and for Russian population, maybe it's more effective to speak about good Ukrainians who are still waiting for Russia, but not about the horrors on Ukrainian access. It's like it's my ideas about it.
Yeah, thanks. Right. I guess, I don't know if anyone wants to talk more about Nazism. I'm happy to do that, but maybe it's enough. And we can, Yulia wanted to also highlight another interesting topic that we've encountered studying Russian propaganda and disinformation. Yulia, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I think it's we actually started from the one of the most popular narratives that come into the Russian official media. We actually caught it in the highly propagandist media sources before the start of full-scale invasion. But after that, those RIA Novosti, TASS agencies, they actually take the style of Russian unofficial propaganda. And it's time to think about how Russian propaganda is not about the visible and the most popular highly propagandist show of Solovyov, Skobiev, and others. And I think that it's time to speak a little bit how Russian official media, how Russian very popular media inside actually Russia, and they spread the propaganda actually. And it's really difficult to find some propagandistic examples there. Of course, they have such news like about the denazification of Ukraine. They obviously also published it, but in the whole news feed of RIA Novosti, it's really difficult to find the most brightful examples of propaganda. But what actually we do in text, we take whole the news feed from different Russian media and look at it with topic modeling, with machine learning algorithm to speak a little bit about how
Yulia, it's something wrong on your side with the video sometimes, and sometimes with the internet connection, I think. Maybe you can turn off your camera and then continue. We still does not hear you, Yulia. I think all of us, yes, doesn't hear Yulia.
And what about now? Oh,
that's much better, Yulia.
I hope. Oh,
that's much better.
Okay. Sorry for that. It's like sometimes it's big trouble to find stable internet connection even in Kiev. So I will continue without video if it will not cause a problem. So I just wanted to highlight that it's really difficult to find some specific, some propaganda techniques in the news feed of Russian official media. But on larger scale, if we will look at whole the news feed with some quantitative analysis and with some machine learning algorithms, some topic modeling techniques, we actually found something more interesting, and propaganda became more and more evident. So first of all, it's like a first example that we have a really big authority of Putin in Russian newsfeed. Putin was mentioned during this year. Putin was mentioned in every 10th Russian news. In each 10th Russian news was mentioned Putin surname, actually. And it was like news about his speeches, and it also was like read more about, or we earlier wrote that Putin mentioned something. And another thing that Zelensky is also quite popular in Russian newsfeed. It's obviously, but it's half as often as Putin. They mention Zelensky in every 20th news item. And for example, in the weekly top 10 most popular politicians in Russian news, usually at least half are representatives of the so-called enemy camp. So if we look at the most popular persons, we see that Biden is on the third place after the Putin and Zelensky, and another Ukrainian partners are also there. So they write much more about enemies and about NATO than about their internal problems or internal politicians. And it's like a big strategical plan of Russian media. And let me share with you a little graph. It's actually about, start from this one. It's like a little story about how we found the new instructions from Kremlin to the main Russian media giants. They all together under one command after the start of tries of Russia to actually defeat Ukrainian energy system. They started to write about every air alert in Ukraine. It's like a new strategy of Russian media that we catched. We just looked at five the most popular official Russian media in their Telegram channels, and thought that before the 10th of October, no one of them hasn't wrote a lot about air alerts in Ukraine. But after that, after the change of strategy, they started to turn every air alert into another so-called victory for Russia. It's like their willingness to show to the Russian population, first of all, because it's it wrote in Russian language for Russian audience in Telegram, and they just tried to show that they still can do something with this war in Ukraine, and that still Russia is cause some problems for Ukrainian population. And just another thing, that it's not about just RIA Novosti, but TASS, RT in Russian language, so-called Komsomolskaya Pravda and RBK, they also just in one day, they changed their strategy of Telegram channels. And it's like another evidence that Russian propaganda is really highly centralized. It's really highly centralized, and it's even difficult to imagine if there is just one center and how many people really coordinate all these types and all this instruction from Kremlin to different types of media, from official media sources, unofficial, to different Telegram bloggers, or for example, farms of bots and trolls. And it's time actually to think about how this centralization of Russian propaganda is it the strength, is it the strength of propagandists, or is it the weakness of them? Maybe you will have some other examples and some ideas of actually how we can use this problems, because I think centralization is not always about the strong side. And maybe you can add something to this.
Anyone? If not, then I'd like to comment. Yeah, I guess so. We are just Ukrainian analysts and data people. We don't know the insides of Kremlin. We just observe, we just download lots and lots of news and observe phenomena like those and make our conclusions out of that. Phenomena like what Yulia is showing to you right now. Apparently, there are, again, Russian independent or journalists or people who work abroad. They claim, or they say, oh, it's probably well known, maybe from intelligence leaks, that there are chief people in Kremlin who are developing these instructions, who send them to the media offices, directorates. So I believe that it is highly centralized. But what I've seen from the analysis of these news feeds, it's like 90% centralized. There are still this maverick, small propagandist outlets that some people that sometimes allow themselves to sort of deflect a little bit from the general line, and it doesn't mean that they're friendlier or more liberal. Usually they're even more vitriolic and aggressive and hateful. And but I think that there is a faction in Russian media that it is even more, that it's like harsher than the mainstream. And also there is media holding of Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's got his own website, Ria Fun, and his own troll farms, his own Telegram channels, and we start seeing, and that's a project I want to do soon. I want to do an analysis on this, on the mentions of Putin, Prigozhin, Putin's generals, and see whether there was a change in mentioning because there is a lot of rumors and leaks that there's an internal war in Kremlin, different powers of Kremlin are fighting with each other. And I wonder if it can be seen in Russian propaganda. I don't know, but we'll have to investigate that. But if it's centralized, I guess it's a weakness, as Yulia said, because you can decapitate this Hydra once and for all, maybe at some day, and it will disappear and just poof. There will be no more lies and hatred on the internet.
It's very optimistic. It sounds really optimistic. But I think that even more example about the weaknesses of such centralization, it's sometimes the low quality of some products. And it's like when we investigated Russian Telegram channels that were created for occupied territories, actually after the start of the full-scale invasion, almost 100 different Ukrainian cities were covered by new telegram channels created by Russian information troops. And it's like we published this project this autumn. It's like here is a map with all the cities for which were created different telegram channels that tried to occupy information area in Ukraine and to prepare for occupation of the population of the city. They tried to look like local news feed, but actually the centralization of Russian propaganda turned it into just one more example, almost 50 telegram channels for different cities was created and in almost the same way. And they started with one absolutely identical message. It's like citizens of city. And then it was a quotation of Russian authorities, and that these Russian authorities are doing everything they can to ease the hardships of the Ukrainian people and so on and so forth. So it's actually the great example of weaknesses of such a level of centralization, just because when you try to create some local pro-Russian news, it's really difficult to create them not from the city, but from the Moscow or from the Donetsk, for example, to create some local news feed for the city not so far from Kiev. And it's actually, or another one, we just looked at the network of reposts and see that here are all those not so natural telegram channels. So actually this project is about, they do a lot for information occupation, but according to this centralized strategy, they did really bad thing for them, and most of these telegram channels were not effective and were not successful actually.
All right. Any questions, anyone? Yes, Svetlana, Dima, can you?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for a very interesting seminar. My name is Svetlana Mazepa. I'm Associate Professor of West Ukrainian National University, and currently my research is about propaganda also. And I'm working on propaganda from law perspective, and first of all about criminalization of new types of propaganda, and analyze the criminal legislation, Ukrainian legislation, and some kind of comparative analysis with European legislation. And I would like to ask you where I can find some statistics, and if I may, I would like to use it for my research. And also it's really interesting to know, do you analyze social media, for example, Facebook or Twitter, etc.? Thank you very much.
Let me try to answer. Thank you for your interest. I will try from the last question. We actually try, first of all, we analyze main sources of Russian propaganda. It's actually Russian newsfeed and Telegram. You know that Telegram now is one of the first sources of propagandistic narratives and topics. We actually started to analyze Facebook. We started it even before the start of full-scale invasion. And the main thing that Facebook, that the moderation of content is a really good thing on the big scope on information. It's really difficult to find some obvious topics and narratives in Facebook, much more difficult than in Telegram with our, for example, algorithm, just because the Facebook have, it's not ideal at all politics about moderation of content. We understand that it still have a lot of weaknesses inside, but it's really difficult for Russian propaganda to operate in Facebook, at least because we first of all analyze Russian propaganda for Russian audience and for Ukrainian audience, and we know that in Facebook they quite weak, for at least if we're talking about official Russian propaganda. We did not look at Twitter too much, just because we know a lot of our partners and other projects actually in Europe analyze Twitter and work with it, and I think that they do it in much better way than we, just because Twitter is still not so popular in Ukraine, and we first of all look at Ukrainian Russian audiences. And I see that Dmitro already mentioned in chat our topic radar. It's our main dashboard where you can find all the statistics on Russian propaganda and Russian narratives during the wartime. And if you're interested in information before the start of the full-scale invasion, we also have so-called old dashboard link you also can find there on our new wartime dashboard. And of course, we conduct some projects like this network of Telegram occupational channels, and we publish in text.org in our data journalist as data journalist project.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Okay, so I would like to also share with you the last brief figure and just discuss it a little bit. Hold on. Oh, no. There it is. Yeah, so as Yulia has just mentioned our dashboard, and Dima shared the link to it. So with this dashboard, we monitor several Russian narratives in the media, but the three of them we think are key for understanding what's going on. It's warfare progress, the anti-Western rhetoric, or the so-called Western threat, and we also observe what do Russians write about the sanctions and the state of their economy. And we've noticed that at first Russians published a lot of combat updates and materials justifying Russian aggression, and well, it's still on the same level. As you can see, sometimes it just if there is a stale situation on the front lines, or there are some significant defeats on the Russian side, they start giving less of those updates. But overall, over this year, it's around the same percentage. But it's really funny how do they not mention their defeats. Like, for example, when the cruiser Moskva was sunk, there was basically nothing on the Russian internet about that. Just a short release about some fire from their Ministry of Defense, short release, and this release was not picked up by and quoted by other media. And the same thing was with the retreat from the north and retreat from the east and so on. But overall, the trend remains stable. And they're also, so instead, Russians publish more, they publish a lot. The second dominating, or sometimes the first dominating narrative, is the war with Western aggression against Russia. And the Russian media are trying to explain to their readers that Russia doesn't fight Ukraine, it fights NATO. and it stands against the malicious West, which is trying to subdue and Russia and ruin people's lives. And there are all sorts of lies, fakes, exaggerations in this kind of publication. And it's an interesting thing, as you can see. It didn't at first. It wasn't that dominating, but then when Russia started losing the fight, when they saw that it's going to be a long, protracted war, this narrative has picked up, and it also remains, remains sometimes even larger than the reports from the actual war. And it's interesting also what the Russians write about sanctions and economic life, and they do not write much about it, to be honest. The language of those publications is very blunt, uncolorful compared to what do they have to say about the West and Ukraine. And it's just Russians write about their economy as if it exists in a completely separate, stable, peaceful world where there are no sanctions and war. It's like, oh, we built another house, or farmers collected a lot of corn, and everything is fine. And that's what Putin actually mentioned today in his speech. He said, "Oh, we had a record harvest last year." So it's like listening to analyzing Putin's speeches. maybe you don't even have to download all those numerous publications, because or Putin repeats them. I don't know. It's just, yeah, he's like gives you if you look deeper into his speeches, it's like a snapshot of a typical Russian newsfeed. And so the discussion around sanctions, it's also completely detached from reality. The authors of the publications, they do not mention the true reasons why the sanctions were imposed. It's just like sanctions appeared out of nowhere. Evil Western countries laid them on Russia, and Russians, so propagandist media, they just blame the West and brag about how sanctions will do or are not doing anything to Russia. However, that sometimes reality is knocking into Russian doors, and sometimes we can see very sad and carefully sounding texts that try to acknowledge the harsh reality. And the authors of these materials and articles, they say that, oh, the damage, we're suffering more and more damage, and maybe people should start preparing for the wars to come. And the most recent example, there was this story with the deficit of lack of drugs in Russia. Basic things like ibuprofen started disappearing, and at first it was like in the regional media, and then this topic started to pick up more and more in the mainstream media, and Putin himself had to comment something about that. But their explanation was, they didn't say it was about because of the sanctions. Instead, they started saying, oh, Europe, it's even worse in Europe. People don't have drugs there as well. So they just, talking about economy and sanctions, they just shift the perspective, and quite often they just tell all the stories about the inflation in the USA, how people are freezing in Europe, how everything will soon fall apart. And yeah, sometimes they say, yeah, it's all right, we understand life is hard in Russia, but it always has been hard. There's no need to like just wait a little bit. maybe something will improve, or we just have to stay strong and brave, because whatever. And Europe is even worse. Don't even think of Europe. That's the how it's quite sad, actually, quite sad to observe this narrative about economies and sanctions. Questions? Yulia, do you have anything to add?
I think it's one of the most interesting insights that we got from our dashboards that you mentioned about the rise of topic on anti-Western rhetoric. It's actually one of the most interesting things that it is so stable during whole the year. It started from the mid of April until today. It is still it's so popular. So they actually changed their strategy, and they started to write more and more about abstract West, about Western enemies for Russia. And it's, I think that the most interesting thing is that why is it so stable, and that it is really, I think that it's stable just because it really works. Yeah, I think it's the most obvious explanation that is this narrative is it works for Russian population, for Russian mass population. And it's really interesting to look at some sociological data. It's difficult, of course, it's difficult to be sure that we can believe all the sociology just because of specifics, yes, of Russian regimes. It's really difficult to take the answers from our Russian population on such question about the war. It's a very sensitive topic, but it's still interesting. It's like, I just want to be that type of analyst who will sometime in the few years will find the answer on what was the impact of this Russian news feed with propaganda of Western enemies everywhere for Russians, and how powerful was this impact on Russian population. And if we can talk about that we are actually now we are talking that the war is not, it's not the war of Putin or of Kremlin. It's actually the war that it's like it's popular among Russian population who still live in Russia, not lived it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to agree. This propaganda, it really affects people's minds, and we see that it's just really years and years of this has done a huge damage to the Russian population. Just it's just subdued them to Putin's rule and put them in an alternative world where they have to fear everyone and everything, believe stories about Nazis and biolaboratories, and then go to war and die there. You know, it's propaganda is a scary thing. Right. So if no one has anything else to add, I think we will.
Yuri,
right?
I just yes, I'd like to add, not to add, but to stress something. Could you please share your last slide one more time? It's yeah, thanks. It's interesting that from the very beginning of the war, we have from the 1st of March, here the graph. it seems like for the Russian leadership, the general Russian public was not needed because they wanted a short, quick war in Ukraine. That's why I think like anti-Western rhetoric was not mentioned a lot in the news, yeah. And then after the first month, first 30 days of the war, they decided to turn on this anti-Western rhetoric and to speak more and more about the West, not about the Ukraine, because their plans were not completed, yeah, in Ukraine. And for me, this is the question. This is the answer for the question why does Russian propaganda work? Because for this moment, after a year of the war, it really works because Russian people go to war. They agree with mobilization, and Russian leadership have no problems with mobilization. Not big problems, maybe some problems they have, but it's not a big problem for Russian leadership to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. And this is no, maybe someone can say that it is about Russia. Here in Ukraine, we are not aware about Russian problems and mobilization, but they even these thousands and hundreds of thousands Russians, they went to our land and they fight against us, and this is our problem also. Maybe that's why we monitor Russian propaganda, or maybe for another for another goal. But it seems that it is important for Ukrainians also, not for Russian citizens. Thanks. Maybe someone have a question or some comments. I knew that some of registered participants asked us about monitoring of social media and TikTok. Maybe Yulia, you could mention our
plans for future.
yes, no, not about plans, maybe about our work on Telegram, and maybe about our plans. Yeah, it be interesting.
Sometimes it's really difficult to make some spoiler for data journalist project, just because sometimes data journalist project, even after months of work on it, we still can't find the story and it's still not published. That's why, but I just want to add that we continue to work on Russian propaganda media monitor. Each week we publish weekly monitoring where we cover main topics of Russian propaganda, and we continue to analyze and investigate propagandist Telegram. And hope that in the next time we will have some big of Telegram news feed among propaganda. Also, Dmitro mentioned TikToks, quite difficult as it's popular, why there are a lot of Russian propaganda, and some media already published the project about it, and we just want to add more and know more about techniques and strategies of Russian disinformators. And if you're interested in our project, you can look to the Texty site, where we published also translated into English materials, and we try to translate most of the materials on Russian disinformation and our main data journalist project. And also we have the you can subscribe to Text's mail. We will send you the main things about Russian propaganda, and not it will not be the too frequent, it will not be a spam, but we will just tell you the most significant things that we actually found. And I think it's time.
Yeah, thank you very much. We can say the last sentences, and you can reach us, Yulia or Yuri, through the social media, or also you can send us mail to text.org.ua@gmail.com. And please goes to us. Please reach our site text.org.ua. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Very much.